All right, I'm going to go ahead and have Mary Ann get started. For everyone that's here already, thank you so much for joining us again. I know that we're all interested in making sure that we understand these report card reforms, and I know that I've had to hear them a few times now before they are settling in. So Mary Ann, we appreciate you joining us again this morning. And we, again, for those of you who signed up, we are going to be breaking these into chunks. So that we can digest section by section sort of what's going on here. So today we're going to be looking at the achievement component, which is that performance index. We're going to be looking at the progress component and then the early literacy component. And then we'll pick this back up next week on Tuesday. All right. So Mary Ann Motley, Director of Report Card Project, take it away this morning.
All right. Thank you. You can see my screen, I assume, and then you can hear me. Good. All right. Yeah. Perfect. All right, so as Vicki said, I'm Mary Ann Motley. I'm director of the Report Card Project. And today we're going to go through 3 of the new components that you'll be rated on for the report cards starting this year. So all 3 of my presentations I'm going to do are going to start with this first slide here, just so that everybody has a solid understanding, if they don't join all 3 sessions, where we are in the process, because our report cards really are a work in progress over the next 3 school years. So we had to revamp all of the calculations, and they went through our State Board of Education, our Joint Committee for Agency Rule Review, which is a group of senators and representatives. And then we also did presentations to the House and Senate Education Committees on how we intend to hold schools and districts accountable for both the state money and the federal money that they get. So that piece there with the little bit darker green with the arrow is where we are now. Even though it's June, we are working on revisions to our Every Student Succeeds plan. We did through June 1st have that plan open for comment, for public comment. That's a federal requirement. And we are in the process of getting that off to the U.S. Department of Education. So we'll continue to implement the report card, as I said, over the next few years. And one thing to understand, I've kind of got an overarching caveat that you'll see on all these presentations, is that, you know, we have to submit this to the federal U.S. Department of Ed, and they use that, we use that to meet the conditions to receive our federal Title I money. So if for some reason they don't approve of something that I'm about to talk about, we'll need to go back and amend that plan. We've tried to work with the feds, and we're really hopeful that everything will go through and it'll be like clockwork and we'll be good. But just, you know, you never know who might be involved that wasn't involved when we were working with them earlier and throws a wrench into it. So as I said, I hope that's not the case. Sorry about that, went the wrong way. Wait a minute. Okay. There we go. Okay, so the way that our new report card is made up, we will have an overall rating starting in 2023, and that will receive a star rating. Individual components receive a star rating, and the components are made up of measures. In some cases, they're individual measures that will, multiple individual measures that will roll up to the component. In some cases, it's just one measure, and then there's some report-only data. And the report-only data, the legislature felt like we needed to provide more information to communities and to put things on the report card so that you all could help tell your story about the good things that you're doing to serve students across your community. And so there will be a lot of new data across these different components to help go beyond the component. So we'll talk through the data as we talk through each component that will accompany that component. So our achievement component, it used to include the performance index, which was 75% of the component rating or letter grade, and then the indicators met measure, which made up the other 25%. So moving forward, the indicators met measure is not going to be a rated measure. That's going to become one of those report only pieces of data that will help tell a story, but won't contribute to any star rating. The other big change is that we're resetting the maximum performance index score. So prior to 2022, a perfect PI, if you will, the maximum that your students would have been expected to get, sort of an optimal level, was 120 points. And the way that that was derived is if all of your students scored advanced on every test they took, your PI score would have been 120 points. Now, obviously, we know that's not realistic because nobody reaches perfection. Nobody operates at an optimal level all the time. Even, students that are high performing students sometimes have concepts that just confound them. And maybe they just have a course or have a grade where they just don't do, their normal level of performance. And so they may miss that advanced cutoff. So really 120 points was pretty much unattainable. And so what the legislature did is that they reset that maximum score to something that they think is doable and set it based on real data. And so what they did was we're going to be taking the top 2% of schools and top 2% of districts to calculate the maximum. So we're actually going to have two different scores, one for the school buildings that will use building level data, and one for the traditional school districts that will combine all those buildings in your districts and will use your district PIs to calculate this. And just to go into a little more detail, how we plan to calculate it, the law actually says that we take the PI scores, not the individual tests behind the score. So we'll calculate your performance indexes for each school and each district exactly like we have in the past in terms of, putting the tests in their buckets based on the range of score where they fall, multiplying the percent of tests in that bucket by the weight to get a number. Then we take all of the individual school districts. There are 607 school districts that usually get a performance index. We have a couple districts that are island districts. Some years they get them, some years they don't, depending on the students that they're serving. So we'll do this for each school, each district, and then rank them the way you see on the screen. We'll calculate what is 2%. So we have to see how many of those schools or how many of those districts actually have a performance index. And then what is 2% of that number? So, for every 100 school districts, we would have 2 that would be in the top 2%. So if we have 607 school districts, to make it easy, we would have 13 would be the number that would include the top 2%. So we take those 13 school districts, we sum their performance indexes, add those 13 numbers together, divide by 13, and get an average. So it's, typical average, just like you've learned in, probably the end of elementary school, middle school math, simple average. And then that number, whatever that average is, becomes the standard against which everybody else is based. And so as you can see on the screen there, if you're in the top handful, you're the top district, you're the top 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever it might be, your PI score is going to be above 100%. You're going to be at 102% or 103% because of the fact that it's an average of those top performing schools or districts. So we'll do this based on current year data. And because we're using current year data, what you have to understand is that that calculation that I just described will not be final until all of our reporting windows for tests are closed and all of the appeals for test scores are processed. So most of you know that, a number of years ago, we were told we had to start to implement an appeals process. So if a school or a district messes up reporting their data, they get a second chance at it, and we let them re-report. There's a short window after the regular reporting window closes where we tell everybody, check your data one last time to make sure it looks good. And if not, file an appeal and send us a new file. So The last reporting window doesn't close till mid-August. Our alternate assessments for students are included in the performance index, and we keep that window open later. The reason we keep it open later is that those tests are not used with our value added calculation. It's only the standard tests. And so there's not as big of a hurry to get those test results reported. It's a separate manifest. You go in separately, or your test coordinator does, and picks up those tests out of the test portal. And so we give you a little more time to report those tests. And that really is just so that you don't have to keep so many balls in the air. You can focus on getting the standard tests reported, then you can focus on the alternate assessments. But what that means is the appeals window is going to be giving districts through August 26th to submit an appealed file. If somebody messes up their alternate assessments, they can submit data up through the close of business on August 26th. So we'll process the next night, like through that night of the 26th into the morning. We'll do final checks to make sure that file processed if anybody did submit appealed data. And so the final PI percentages, if it's a top performer, one of those that's in the top 2%, their PI score could change the morning of August 27th. And we'd have to go back and do that calculation that I just showed, where we're going to have to do that average all over again. If it's district number 1, district number 2 that appealed their data. So the final PI percentages will not be known, and where you fall will not be known until just before the report cards are released. Now, our hope obviously is that we don't have a massive amount of appeals and a massive amount of data. If you appeal one student's test that you did a rescore for, that doesn't change your PI score and impact it dramatically. It may impact it to the 1,000th or the 10th or the 100th, but it's not going to go from 102 to 110. So, what takes it from something like 102 to 110 is when there's massive errors in the reporting, where somebody just forgets to report data, or it didn't go through and they didn't realize it didn't come through. And then they have to submit an entire school's or district's worth of tests. But that is something to keep in mind. And the legislature was very deliberate when they put the current year data and required us to use it, because they want that tide to float and ebb, to surge and ebb with what happens in, with students and in communities and with school districts and just school in general. And they were thinking, of course, about the last 2 years and all of the learning loss and problems that kids are facing with lower test scores because of the pandemic. So if we had used a prior year data in the first year of the pandemic, then that data would have held you to an accountability level that was unrealistic. And then coming back, as students improve, if we're using lagged data, it would hold you to a lower standard than probably what should be expected. So it's the current year data. That way, if we change tests, if God forbid we have another pandemic or something else comes in to interrupt students' education, then whatever the scores are would be reflected in that max score.
There's a quick question in the chat box,
Yes.
Marianne. Where do community schools fall? Are they considered the district or the school?
Yeah, so the community schools are only in the building calculation. So they will be in the denominator when we say, and we go back and we do the same calculation that I had on the screen here for buildings, we'll have close to 3,000 schools. The only schools really that don't get a PI score are those that serve students under the age or under the grade of 3. So once our 3rd grade tests start, all the way pretty much through high schools, you're going to have tests. And so there are some K2 schools or kindergarten 1 buildings, things like that. And what we're doing is we're not throwing them in the denominator when we say how many schools do we have and what is 2% of that number, because that really would, inflate the number, and they're not contributing anything because they didn't test their students. So yes, community schools are in the building file when we say how many schools are there. And then if there were high performers, and there are a couple of of schools, community schools that are very high performing. If they're in the top 2%, their data would be used to help set that school performance index. So the other big change that was made to the PI score is the types of tests that are included. So the law says, starting this year, wherever possible, we have to use the summer third grade English test if it's administered. Now, this summer, I don't know how many schools are going to administer third grade tests. There's an exclusion that we'll talk about this when we get to early literacy from the promotion. So kids can be promoted to fourth grade this year, even if they don't otherwise meet a pathway to promotion, if the reading teacher and the principal and the parent working with the parent believe that the child is ready for fourth grade, ready to move on. So we've heard that they may not have as many third grade tests because it doesn't really need to be used. You know, some schools still want to gauge how effective were they with summer school or a summer intervention program. But a lot of them are saying that, you know, it's just one more thing that they would have to do to bring a student in the middle of the summer to get them tested. The test is like right at the end of June, heading just before 4th of July week. So, you know, we don't know how many will be used, but if it's administered, it will be used, but it's going to be a little bit different because the scores don't come back till the end of summer. So we're going to do a load the data into our warehouse from the vendor. So Cambium sends us a file with the test scores, the SSIDs and the scale score, and for the third grade test, the sub-score for reading. We will load all of that. We will then show it to districts, and then you would have a short appeal window. So if you think that what we loaded is different than what you got from the vendor, and you think that what you got from the vendor is correct, then you can appeal that and say, no, change that student's summer score. He really got a 702 and you've got him in as a 697. And so that's how we, and the reason we have to do it that way is that statutorily, the report cards must be released no later than September 15th. So there just really isn't time to get those scores in the traditional way that we do, where your EMIS coordinator submits a file in EMIS. The way that it's processed, we've got to cut some corners, so and cut some time off. But we've done this process for the last few years. I mean, this actually is no different than what we did last year or the year before that or the year before that, you know, other than the year that we didn't administer tests because of the pandemic. But we do it that way because we also use that data for promotion and, you know, to determine whether or not in a regular year a student's promotable to fourth grade. And so the process works well, and districts are well aware that they need to check that file and file an appeal. And the reality is we get very few appeals. The only appeals we usually get are things like late batch or breach tests. Sometimes the vendor and what we get is an initial file. If there is a late batch or a rescore or a breach, those come later, and we don't get those in the vendor file. They're sort of one-offs that the vendor gets directly to the district. So those have to be appealed in some cases. The other change that we're making is adding back the science and social studies tests at the high school level. So back in 2013, those were taken out by the legislature. They put them back they amended the law to put them back. And the other thing that they did, the reason they took them out was because kids could take those substitute tests, the advanced placement or international baccalaureate tests, in lieu of using those state tests for graduation purposes to earn points on tests back when the points on tests were used. They can still use those substitute tests for the seals. So there's a science and a civics seal, and so they can use those substitutes. And so we are including those substitutes, and there's quite a list of them. So these are all of the tests. And one of the things you'll notice is that the science goes way beyond biology. So biology is our state assessment. But what we decided to do for the science seal, kids can use any of these assessments to fulfill that seal. So it's a science rather than a biology seal. And science includes the physical science and, health sciences and things like that, environmental science. And so we decided we would go ahead and give credit, because if somebody's doing something for a seal for graduation, it's likely that they're engaged in that subject, and it's likely that they're going to do well, that they're going to perform pretty well on that. And so we are allowing any of these to come in because we believe that in the long run, it will benefit the districts in terms of giving you a higher score. So if somebody's more chemical science or, environmental or health science oriented, physics, they're probably, they may do better in that strand of the standards than biology in a biological science. And so we're going to give you credit. The way that it works is we would use the higher of, if a student takes the state test and they take one of these tests, we would use the higher of the two, because kids for federal purposes still do have to take the state biology test. So at this point, we have not been cleared to give them free pass from taking that state test. So they still have to take biology at some point. When they take the class, they have to take the test. Or when you've decided, if they never take standard biology, when you've decided the biology standards are taught to that student, then you test them with that test. But we would use the higher of the two. And for all of these tests, there's a rubric that they use for graduation. And so we would put them in the same buckets. So a 1 would be a 1. For an AP test, a 2 and 3, a 2 is proficient, a 3 is accelerated, and a 4 and a 5 is advanced. For IB, it's on a scale of 1 to 7. So it's a 1 would be in the limited range, 2 and 3 are proficient, 4 and 5 are accelerated, and 6 and 7 are advanced. Now, obviously for government and for history, the list is much shorter because there just aren't as many tests. I mean, for AP and IB, history and government, there really is only one set of tests. The IB test for politics, there's a standard and higher level, but otherwise there's just one test. But that's something to understand. Some of these tests are pretty new. I mean, the tests themselves have been around forever, but we're just in the process of starting to collect all the codes. In the past, we used to have an other, which was kind of a catch-all. If your test didn't have its own code, you could use that other test and report and we didn't know which test it was. Now we need to know the names of all the tests because of all of them being used. So that's something to work with both your test coordinator and your EMIS coordinator. We have been doing trainings on those.
Marianne, someone typed in the chat box CCP substitute test.
Okay, yeah, so College Credit Plus, yes, for the seals and for graduation, kids can use a course grade. So what they do is if they take a College Credit Plus class in one of those subjects, they can use the class grade. We are not including class grades per the law. And the reason I think the legislature didn't do that is that this is really about how deeply do kids understand standards. And while we know that a class grade really should reflect that, there's a lot of subjectivity in issuing grades. Some professors will give extra credit and say, if you do this extra project, we can raise your grade 1 letter. Some grade on a curve, some, are very strict and nobody gets an A. I had a couple of those in college. And, they were real upfront and saying, nobody will get an A in my class. So the best you can hope for is a B+. And so, we don't use that because there's a lot of subjectivity and a lot of variation in between the classes. If you take the class at Ohio State, it may be different than Columbus State, which may be different from Capital, and they're all located here in Franklin County and so on. So I guess that, that's my understanding of why the legislature did not include those. Now, kids can still use it for graduation, and I would encourage kids, obviously, to take College Credit Plus and to do, all kinds of advanced coursework, whatever works best for them and is going to get them what they need to be where they need to be at the end of their high school career. But it's just they're not in this measure. So they would still have to take at some point, if they took, say, College Credit Plus biology or a history class or something, they'd still have to take the state's test. Or if they feel that an IP or an IB or AP test are better aligned to the class they're taking, they can take those. That you don't have to take the AP version of the class to take the test, although, I don't know how well you'd perform if you didn't take it. So this shows the performance index. And as I said earlier, the calculation itself is just like it always was, where we calculate the percent of the tests, how many tests should have been taken. The tests that were not taken go into that untested bucket and you earn 0 points. Then all the other tests go into their buckets, and we calculate what percent of the total did that make up times the weighting. And the weighting did not change. One of the things our state board did look at was the weighting. And we actually showed them that because we're curving, if you will, we're taking that perfect PI, that maximum score, and curving it down, that we didn't need to change the weights, that curving it really sets it up so that it works with these weights. So this is a real district. It's posted on the report cards in the public site today. So I wanted to use this as an example. So in 2021, this is 21 data, this particular district got the 85.2, which was 71%, because it's out of a possible 120. 85.2 divided by 120 gives you 71%. If the max score was 105.8, then it would be 80.5%. So you'd go up almost 10%, this particular district would have. And why that's important is that we still have the same cut points. And this is using 2019 data. And this shows you, this gives you a good pictorial of how things have changed since the pandemic. If we had had this calculation in 2019, the max scores would have been just over 109 and just over 111, respectively, for schools and districts. And so you can see the percent of districts and percent of schools that would have fallen into each of those 5 categories. And this is the same grade scale that we used in terms of percent of points, 90, 80, 70, 50, that we used since 2013. This is how it changed in 2021. And that's where I got my 105.8. So if you look at the district or the school max score, it's 105.8. And how that would have affected this particular school is it would have jumped from having 3 stars or a C letter grade using the old rating system up to a 4-star or a B under the system. So, and then you can see the numbers there. And this is what the State Board of Education was looking at when they decided to leave some of the things the same, both the grade scale and those weights. So the other thing that our law does is that it says that all of our ratings have to have descriptors, because they felt like just saying 5 stars or 3 stars or something like that didn't adequately give a description to the communities. And people used to complain. I know some of the members of the field would complain to their legislators that when they saw C's on the report card, that they felt like somehow they failed, because, a C is average. It's just kind of plodding along. And that's not what it meant, but they felt like some members of their community felt that that was what it was, that it was, that bare minimum versus something that's meeting standards. And so what we had to do, our state board had to come up with descriptors. so that people understood that a 3-star rating is not just plodding along and doing the bare minimum you need to get by, but rather it's meeting the state standards in academic achievement, which is what you would expect. It's meeting expectations. And so they came up with these descriptors that will be seen on all of the report cards. And what we're working to do is, if you get one of those, as you get one of those star ratings, the correct descriptor will pop up under it or next to it. We're still kind of, working with the design people on where to put these, but it'll somewhere be right next to the rating. So that if you have a 3-star, it clearly says you've met the standards. And so hopefully that will help as you work with your community to bring a better way of understanding this and a better light to a 3-star rating. So as I mentioned at the beginning, our indicators met will become report only data, meaning it doesn't count for anything, but rather will just have data so that you can, again, offer something to explain to your community how your kids are performing. This calculation won't change, except, again, we would use that summer 3rd grade ELA test. And that only helps because, again, we use a student who takes a test more than one time in a single school year. We use the highest score from all attempts. So right now, we've always looked at the fall and the spring and used the higher of the two. If they have a 3rd score and it's a summer score, we would use the highest of the 3. No labels of met or not met will be there. That language at the top will somehow be changed. So there is no 80%. There is no expectation on this. It's just, what did the kids do? How did they perform? How many were proficient? And so if you look at your report cards today, this is what the indicators look like, because we didn't give them a rating or a grade in 2021. And so that table really won't change other than to, change the text at the top there. The other thing we are getting rid of is the end of course improvement indicator. That was this catch-all that was, we called it the retest indicator. And it really was about kids who had to retake tests for graduation. Were they ultimately getting to the point that they could get enough points to graduate? Well, points on tests are gone. So kids have to meet the competency score on the Algebra 1 and the ELA 2. And there are some other pathways they can take to show competency. And then they have to earn 2 seals. And some of the seals use some of the tests, like I said earlier, the science and the civics use our science and social studies tests. But other things are included in those seals. And so kids don't necessarily have to perform stellar on all of their tests in order to graduate. So kids aren't going to be retaking tests the way that they did in the past, because of the fact that if they don't do well in a particular course, they can move on and do a different seal and still get out. So we won't have that end of course improvement indicator. And then the other 2 things that we'll talk about later, but are moving out of the indicators met, are chronic absence and the gifted indicator. We have to continue to have chronic absence matter and be used in a rating somewhere, because that's what we're using to fulfill what the feds call the other academic indicator. And so we have to use that somewhere. That's moving to gap closing. And when we get to gap closing, we'll talk about in the 3rd presentation next week, how we are going to incorporate that. Gifted indicator also is moving to gap closing. So we'll talk about that then. So you'll just see the individual assessments, the English, the math, the science, the social studies, and the percent of students who score proficient or higher. The students who count for you will be the same. It's of the kids that are otherwise accountable to your school or district who actually took a test, how many pass and versus how many didn't, what percent are passing. Passing is 700 or higher for the OSTs. So for this, the untested students are not included, and they will continue to not be included. So any other questions on achievement and all the things I've talked about before we talk about progress. See, I see something in the chat. What kind of data will appear under the other tabs? So under the other tabs, we'll have some comparison data where we show your district to similar districts and to the state as a whole. And we actually have those data now, and you can continue to see those. So we'll continue to calculate, if your English was at 76.9 and your math at 84%, for example, how did you compare to your similar district average? Were you above, below, comparable? And then how did you do to the state as a whole? The achievement levels look at a bar chart and plot out for each individual test what students are in the limited range, the basic, proficient, accelerated, advanced, and advanced plus. And then the trend data shows the test performance over time. So we go back with a rolling 5 years of data. And of course, because 2020 is in that 5th year or within those 5 years, we're going to have a break because we didn't test. But we show the performance, what % of students scored proficient or higher in each of the last 5 years, so that your communities can show, are more kids proficient this year than last year? And are more kids proficient last year than 2 years ago, and so on. So is achievement improving? Is it staying the same? And again, right now they're able to see the pre-pandemic and the post-pandemic. So they're going to have quite a lot of data. And then somebody said, will the wording also be changed from indicators met to just indicators? Yes, exactly. That's one of the pieces that we're in the process of doing edits. And all of the screenshots that I have, I grabbed off the 2021 report cards, because our 2022 is a work in progress and we're moving things around and adding things. So yes, we would just call them indicators. So kind of like that tab does. So we'll move on to progress. So our progress measures looking at the academic performance of students compared to an expected amount of growth. So what we do, we've calculated a value-added measure since 2006. And again, this was initially created in statute. The law has changed a little bit over time in terms of, we'll kind of go through a little bit of the history. It's changing again, but the overall calculation really hasn't changed. And we're looking at a particular school or district's change in achievement. So it's about a group of students and the change in achievement from one year to the next for that group. And in this case, the group is all the students in the school or all the students in the district. And it's gauged from one year to the next against an expected amount of change. And the expected amount of change is an average. So we basically say, if a group of students is getting a certain amount better, if they're increasing their level of achievement by a certain amount, then that average is the expected amount. So, and it goes both ways, again, because we're coming out of this pandemic, achievement dropped. And so the expected amount of achievement was lower in 2021 than it was in 2019, simply because that's what everybody did. And so, as people rise and fall, as the groups of kids rise and fall with their test scores, the expected amount of change rises and falls because it's an average. That methodology has been used since 2006, and we're going to continue to use that. But we're going to add an additional calculation to calculate something called an effect size. What we've calculated in the past is called a growth index. So the growth index is, the definition is that there's evidence that the growth measure is above or below the expectation of growth. And what we do, because of the way that we calculate this, there are some things built into the calculation, and the calculation itself protects schools and districts from being misclassified by falsely saying that the growth was above or below when it really wasn't. or saying that it wasn't above and below when it really was. So it works both ways. We use some standard statistical techniques. These are things that are widely accepted in the statistical world. And we basically say, if there's a certain amount of evidence that students on average in that school is making more or less growth than expected, then we were previously assigning a letter grade of either an A or a B if it was above, or a D or an F if it was below. And the way that this calculation starts is that all districts and schools that are meeting expectations, meaning they would get a C until the weight of the data said otherwise. They start out meeting until the weight of the data or the certainty is otherwise. And I'll explain a little more of how this worked. The calculation itself, we look at the difference in achievement. So we are looking at achievement here, and we're using the prior year achievement compared to the current year achievement. And they use all prior tests and all current tests when looking at that achievement to measure it, to create a growth measure. So if the change is positive, it's a positive number. If it's negative, it becomes a negative number. And then they divide that growth measure, that positive or negative number, by a standard error. And then there are thresholds in statistics. And what we did was we assigned the letter grades based on those statistical cut points. So 1 standard deviation and 2 standard deviations is the standard in statistics for saying that there's enough evidence to warrant something other than average, other than a C, C rating. And so if there was moderate evidence that the student's growth was more or less than expected, we would move up or down, previously to a B or a D. If there was significant evidence, which is 2 standard deviations above and below the mean, then we would say it was an A or an F. So now we're adding an effect size. And an effect size not only looks at how much growth there is, it's looking at the magnitude of that growth. And it can be used to indicate substantive or practical significance rather than statistical significance. So the calculation shown on the screen there, we're using that same growth measure, but we're dividing by the standard deviation of student achievement. So there are thresholds that statisticians set, the experts in this, to say, is it statistically significant? And is that magnitude such that it means something? And so we have put the magnitude, the way that it's going to work is that everybody will start at 3 stars based on the growth index. And then if there is statistical evidence that the observed growth was above or below the growth expectation, that the kids did better or didn't do as well as what was expected, that alone can move a rating from the 3-star rating up to a 4-star or down to a 2-star. So that's kind of how we did it before, and then we were done. In the very, very beginning, we had 3 levels that was above, met, and below. So we're going back to using that as the first step. So you go up to 4 stars, down to 2 stars, or you stay at 3 stars. Then we implement that effect size to determine the magnitude of growth. So if they had a significant magnitude that the growth was above or below, then they go up to 5 or down to 1. Otherwise, if there isn't a significant magnitude that the growth or lack of growth was there, they stay at the 2 or the 4. And this is what it looks like. So this is a plot of every school. We've got our value added gain index there on the x-axis. That's what we used to assign the letter grades using. And then we've got the effect sizes. And you see those are also positive and negative with the 0 there in the middle. and we can plot every single school, all of the pluses there. Each plus is an individual school. So in the old system, we would use either a plus and minus 1 or a plus and minus 2. And so this is showing the old plus and minus 1 that we originally had and how we would assign the above, met, and below. Then we moved to the 5 letter grades and we assigned them based on a plus and minus 2. And so an A was anything that was positive 2 or higher, and F was negative 2 and lower. And then the B and the D range there was between positive 1 and positive 2, and then negative 1 and negative 2. And then the C was in the middle, something in between 1 and negative 1. And when you look at this, I mean, basically the tails are infinite. You know, you can see that the plots there, they go out to positive and negative 10. And when we combined 3 years of data, and when we did a 3-year gain index, you know, you had some schools and districts that were in the positive 30s and some in the negative 30s, because there was so much data and the level of certainty that the growth or lack of growth was real was so certain. You know, it'd be like saying, you know, I'm 110% sure that the growth is real or the lack of growth is real. So these numbers, the tails were infinite. And so what you had was that really weird distribution that you see there, where there's very few B's and D's, a few more C's, but then you had a lot of A's and F's. And so it was, you know, it was almost a certainty if you were a big district, because of the amount of data that you had, that you were either going to be an A or an F because of how sensitive this was. So what the effect size does is it adds that second cut point. And so from now on, this is what it's going to look like. You'll still start out in the middle. You'll move over to the right half or the left half based on the growth index alone, and or stay in the middle. If if your growth index is right in the middle, then you'll stay at a 3-star. But then if you've moved over to the right or the left there of the cut points, then we factor in that effect size to determine whether you stay in the 4 or move up to the 5, or stay in the 2 or move down to the 1. Now, the one thing to understand, because of the difference in the size and the amount of data that we have, the effect sizes have to be different for schools than they are for districts. So when you look at this, you know, up until now, I've been showing you all school level data. So each of those pluses was a school. And so setting the cut points at positive and negative 0.2 gives you a pretty decent distribution. If we move it up to a positive 0.1, you would have a lot more in the 5-star range and a lot more in the 1-star range. And so the state board decided to set these cut points at plus and minus 0.2 for schools. For districts, because there's more data, there's more homogeneity to the data, we set them at a positive and negative 0.1. So, and again, that was just to get a more normal distribution. When they looked at this, they were very concerned and wanted something that looked a little more normal, like a normal curve. And so they set it up this way. Both of them use the positive and negative 2 for the value added growth index. So to move you from 3 stars over to 2 or 4, so to the left or right. The other thing that changed per state law is the colors. So if you notice, we're using blues, and then the 3-star is now green, the 4-star or the 2-star is yellow, and the 1-star is red. The law says, again, I think there was a very negative connotation to value added and progress because of the fact that it was yellow, that the 3-star, the C letter grade was yellow. you equate yellow to caution, danger, Will Robinson, that kind of thing. And so the law changed and said that the 3-star rating is green and that the 1-star rating was red. And the board had to come up and do the rest of the stars. And since we thought about doing different shades of green, but there are a lot of people, quite honestly, that don't see green to begin with. They're colorblind, and that's one of the common colors. And we were concerned that even people who have some recessive color blindness where they see green, they can't differentiate between color green, sea green from evergreen, from, baby green, those kinds of things. So, lime green, pea green. So they decided they would do blue. So that's what you see there, the new colors that will be when you look at your value added, that heat map. And the colors will actually be a little bit different on the heat map than what I've got here. I need to change these hex colors because our communications office finally figured out or decided what colors to use. And they pick colors based on what's going to be the least sensitive to people who have issues seeing different colors. So, but that's what the colors will look like. So a couple of other changes with progress. We used to calculate 4 different calculations that contributed to the letter grades. And it was a 55, 15, 15, 15 split if you had all 4 of them. So we had the all students or overall progress. Then we had students with disabilities, students in the lowest 20%, and gifted. We're no longer calculating those for progress. They no longer contribute at all to the progress rating. It'll just be all students. So students with disabilities and students in the lowest 20% are not being calculated at all. They won't be used for anything. The gifted still is calculated because it's part of the gifted indicator. And again, we'll talk about that at a later session when we talk about gap closing, because gifted is moving to gap closing. So you'll just have your all students that will be the progress rating. And then the summer English scores will be sent to our value added vendor SAS where applicable. So we always send them, we've always sent them both the fall tests and the spring tests. So then we'll also send them summer tests if they exist for those handful of students. And what SAS does is when they calculate growth from 3rd grade to 4th grade, they use the accountable test, which is the highest of now the 3 tests, if they exist. It was always the higher of the 2. So the same one that we use for other pieces of the report card, like the performance index. So, we don't get growth in 3rd grade, but that's the base that is used to launch the 4th grade growth. So for this, we only looked at 2019 data. On the 2021 report cards, we have data for diagnostic purposes, but we did not calculate a final composite score because of the fact that we were skipping a year's worth of tests. It was incomplete data because we didn't have some 4th grade growth because those kids hadn't taken 3rd grade tests, and the kids in 3rd grade English had taken the fall test only. And so rather than trying to do something incomplete, they looked at 2019 data. So this is the distribution. And as you can see, it's a much more normalized curve. The biggest percentage is going to be a 3-star rating in that green. And then you're going to have, as you go to the tails, you're going to have fewer for the most part. So again, we have to have those descriptors so that, it's clear that a 3-star rating is not just barely plodding along and doing the bare minimum to get by, but rather is meeting standards, meeting the growth expectation. So, and I think value added, again, because of that yellow coloring in the past, was one that really brought a lot of comments to the legislature. So the other two pieces that we have to report, the law did not change where it says that we have to combine across 3 school years. So when up and through 2019, when we were doing our value added, we literally were taking 3 classes of students. So 3 cohorts. So we were combining in that 2019, the kids who sat in your classes, say in 5th grade, and took 5th grade tests in the spring of 19, and the scores that they got, the growth that they made between 4th and 5th grade, with this another group of 5th graders who sat in those same classrooms a year earlier and took tests in 2018, and the kids who sat in those classrooms in 2017 and took the 2017 5th grade tests. So that law didn't change. Now for this year, because we are changing the calculation, we will go back to a single year. And in 2021, we showed a 1 year because of the fact that we didn't have tests in 2020 and we didn't want to combine a pre-pandemic year of 2019. So we will have 2022 data as a single year, but then in 2023, we'll use 2 years. 2024 and beyond, we'll have back to the 3. So when we do this and when we have multiple years, we also have to display for report only purposes the most recent school year's data. And that is because, we had a lot of complaints when we had the old calculation, and principals or superintendents would say, we made a lot of changes. We took you seriously. We revamped our curriculum. We remapped to the standards to make sure we're covering everything that's going to be tested. We changed personnel, got the right people on the right seats on the bus, but our value added for this year looked really good. It showed that our hard work and our changes paid off. But because we had these 2 prior years before we made the change, our rating still is really low. So this will help you tell your story by putting the most recent year there. And then we also have to show some composites for the previous 3 years, so some trend data. So again, you can see if things are moving, is that needle moving? And again, all of this will actually start next year because there really isn't anything to combine. We don't want to show an old calculation from a skipped year of testing with this new calculation. So any questions on progress before we cover early literacy? All right. So we'll go ahead. We'll talk about early literacy. So this is looking at literacy, in reading by the end of 3rd grade. And we know from all the studies that we've ever seen that from kindergarten to 3rd grade, kids learn to read, but from 4th grade on, they've got to read to learn. And so reading and literacy is so important in these early grades. So when they created the K-3 literacy improvement measure, it really was about taking kids who are not on track with reading and getting them to on track. And one of the big complaints is that didn't happen overnight. It couldn't. So when you get kids in your kindergarten classrooms, they might have a level of literacy of a 3-year-old, that would be expected normally of a 3-year-old in terms of, their ability to have phonemic awareness and the vocabulary that they have. And if you have a 5-year-old, 5.5 that's functioning several years lower than they should, it isn't going to happen overnight that they bounce up to being on track with their literacy skills. That takes time. And so there was a lot of complaints about the fact that we were looking at year over year and the level of change was relatively small. And so they said, we don't get between kindergarten and 1st grade a student up to grade level. We can't because they're so far behind when they come to us, but we do a really good job by the end of 3rd grade of meeting that goal. From kindergarten to 3rd, they learn to read so that from 4th grade on, they can read to learn. And we knock it out of the park there. So this measure, this component has changed to include 3 measures. So we're going to be looking now at proficiency in 3rd grade reading. So when the kids take that 3rd grade test only, they get both a full ELA scale score. that measures how well they both understand the reading standards and the writing standards. And then they get a reading subscore that takes just the questions that deal with the reading standards and rescores the test and gives them just a score on that piece of it, taking out the parts that deal with writing. So we're using that reading subscore, which is a 2-digit score for that. We're also looking at promotion to 4th grade and then improving K-3 literacy. Now, the first thing I'll tell you with this is, in the past, the state board said if somebody is not on a reading improvement and monitoring plan, and they don't reach proficient on that 3rd grade English test, we would deduct 1 student off your calculation, 1 off of the numerator. So if you had too many of those kids, it really knocked your grade down. Because we have so much more going on with this calculation now, it's much more robust, and we're using other pieces of data, we no longer have that RIMP deduction. That's per state law that we don't have that. But what I've been telling people when I do these presentations is, it doesn't mean that you can relax and not identify kids and not serve them. Because if you don't serve them with the appropriate services, whether it's a RIMP or some other intervention that's not a RIMP, but is just some kind of an academic intervention, you probably won't have too many kids scoring proficient in reading by the end of 3rd grade. And you may not have in future years kids that are promotable to 4th grade. So it obviously is still really important to identify kids and to do it with fidelity and to make sure that you're serving and addressing any deficits that they might have. And I know you all know that. That's, I'm preaching to the choir on that one. So, and I know that you do a very good job, but just something to keep in mind, that obviously this is much more robust. So the other piece to this that we've always had is that the legislature felt if almost every student comes to school ready to learn to read, so they're functioning at a kindergarten level, they're ready to start tackling literacy, that you shouldn't get this calculation. And in the past, they had set it at 5%, because their thinking was if only 5% of the kids are coming in, it's such a minority, such a small subset of students that it really isn't fair to give you a letter grade. So they've increased this to 10%. But what they're saying now is if you have less than 10% of the kids coming to school not on track, then you only don't get the improving K-3 literacy piece. So you would still have the other 2 pieces. You would still have a star rating. You just won't have all 3 pieces. So let's talk through these in a little bit of detail. As I said before, there are 2 different scores, and the reading subscore is a 2-digit rather than 3-digit, between 16 and 86. And a score of 50 deems a student proficient with their reading. So that's the goal. That's what you have to get the kids to in order to put them in the numerator and get credit for them in this piece of it. So when we're talking about who's going to be included, we've had accountability rules for, 20 some years now, since we really started with the report cards and started, determining who should count for you. And the way that we do it, there are all kinds of business rules, but the main business rule is a student has to be continuously enrolled for a majority of the year. And we use from the first Friday of October, first full week of October, that Friday, through March 31st. And that basically says you had adequate time to serve them. And so they should count for you. We will continue to use that same business rule here. So you're only going to be held to getting a student to proficient if you've had an adequate opportunity to remediate or to serve them, to identify any kinds of problems that they might be having with their reading. So it's the same kids that'll be evaluated for proficiency in the 3rd grade indicator, but there are a couple of differences. So the first difference is that because there are 2 scores, the decision was made, if a student has a full-blown scale score reported, so we know they took the test, but they didn't take don't have a sub-score reported, you always will get a sub-score if you have the full test. You would be counted in the denominator because you did take the test, but you would be not in the numerator. So we would count you as not proficient. So one of the things that we're starting to remind people, check your data to make sure you have the same number of students in both your third grade indicator and your third grade proficiency on the third grade's sub-score. So if you have that, if that looks the same, then you're good. If you have a bunch of kids in third grade indicator and nobody in this or nobody proficient, and you're showing, on the full ELA test, a lot of kids that are proficient, double check to make sure you reported your sub-scores. The other difference is the alternately assessed kids. So, we do have an alternate assessment for kids with significant cognitive disabilities. That test has no sub-scores. So they are in the third grade indicator because they do get a full-blown ELA scale score for that test, but they will be removed from the denominator here because we can't calculate whether they're proficient on just the reading part because it's just they don't have that score. So when you're looking at those differences, you may have 2 or 5 or 10 or however many, you may even have more than that if you're a big district in third grade taking an alternate assessment. And so you'd have to factor those kids out, and they won't be in your denominator either. So those are the two differences in that piece when we're looking at how to calculate this. For promotion to the fourth grade, the law says we have to calculate the percent of students who are promoted to fourth grade and not subject to retention. So for this year, it's going to be a little bit different because the law said if the academic performance in third grade was such that it's below grade level, but the principal and reading teacher in consultation with the parent all agree the student's prepared to be promoted to fourth grade, that student can go ahead and be promoted. So as long as you're reporting the students this year as being promoted, they're not subject to retention per that law. Even if they don't meet a pathway to promotion, they're not subject to retention. We will include them in the numerator. So make sure that every student who's promoted has a code of some type indicating that they are eligible for promotion. In future years, there are multiple pathways to be promoted, and they include reaching the promotion score on the ELA test, which right now is at a 683. And our state board actually is just talking now about what to set it at for the upcoming school year. And the same thing with the promotion score on the reading sub-score. So for this year, it was set to 46, and they're talking about where to set it next year. There's also an English learner exemption for kids that are in US schools for less than 3 years. There's a students with disabilities exemption if their IEP specifically exempts them from retention. Students who attain competency on the alternative assessment are exempt from retention. And then there's also something we call a prior retention exemption. And that basically says if a student's gotten intensive remediation in reading for at least the last 2 years and was sometime previously retained in a grade from K to 3, they don't need to be retained again. So all of those students in any of those pathways in future years would either be promoted, so they would be, their academic promotion would be such that they are promotable to fourth grade, or would be such that they were not subject to retention. So moving forward, it'll be really important to report those things. And we actually are asking you to report based on these codes this year. Each of these is a code on the retention record. And we're asking schools and districts because we want to know how many of them actually met a promotion pathway versus how many did that exemption where the principal, reading teacher, and the parent agreed the student was ready to be promoted. So if you've got kids that are EL exempt, students with disabilities exempt, that they attained that competency on, if they're using the MAP or the STAR or there's 4 or 5 of them, I think now, iReady, the Terra Nova, on that alternative assessment, if they're getting there, report that in EMIS so that we can see this. If we had calculated this the traditional way, this is what would have happened. And part of the reason that it's so important to report this is that we are going to be going back and looking at data. I'll show you when we get to this, how this STAR rating will be awarded. And our State Board of Education wanted to look at data for the next few years to make sure that those grade scales are set where they need to be. And this will give us 1 more year of data to help us with that. So the last piece is the improving K-3 literacy. And this really is calculated the way it always has been. So what we do is we have the 4 grade pairings. So we look at kids who took a diagnostic in kindergarten in the prior year, in 2021 in this case, and were not on track with their reading, and then came back this year and took a 1st grade diagnostic. So how many of those not on track kids became on track by 1st grade? We do the same thing for 1st to 2nd, and I've got a typo. I just noticed it should be 1st to 2nd and 2nd to 3rd instead of 2nd to 3rd twice. So it's kindergarten to 1st, 1st to 2nd, 2nd to 3rd, and 3rd diagnostic to 3rd English test. So how many kids started their grade pairing not on track, and by the end of that, when they took the 2nd diagnostic, became on track? As I said earlier, unlike the previous versions of the calculation, there won't be a deduction for those kids who don't get to proficient on their English test in 3rd grade and were not on a reading plan. So it's just the natural percentage, how many kids became on track from 1 year to the next. And then this is the piece again, if you have fewer than 10% of your current year kindergartners, so kids who took the diagnostic in the fall of 2021 in kindergarten, if that number is less than 10%, a ratio of 10%, and or the other way to say it is, if more than 90% or more were on track, then you don't have this piece. So this is what it looks like when we calculate all of these pieces. And again, we're going to be showing data to our state board over the next few years so that they can regulate and go back and confirm that everything is correct. So when you have all 3 pieces, it's a 40 to 35 to 25 split. When you have 2, because you don't have that improving K-3 literacy piece, it's a 60-40 split. That's in state law. The way that it works is each of these is going to yield a percentage. We take those percentage by the weight, multiply by the weight to get a weighted percentage. We sum the 2 or 3 numbers together, and then we're going to award the rating based on that combined component percent. Now, in a few really weird cases, somebody might have a K-3 literacy piece and not have one of the other pieces. For example, if you're a K-2 school, you aren't going to have 3rd grade reading proficiency potentially because you don't have a 3rd grade, and you're not going to have promotion to the 4th grade because everybody's just going on to 3rd at the intermediate school if you have a primary intermediate. So your rating will be based on improving K-3 literacy alone. That'll be 100%. There also could be a few that have improving K-3 literacy and have proficiency on 3rd grade, but not promotion. And the way that would work is if you had accelerated kids. So I'm a K-2 school, but I have a bunch of 2nd graders who are accelerated in reading. They're going to take the 3rd grade reading test. So if I have 10 of those kids, I would get the proficiency in reading, but I'm still not promoting them to 4th grade because for every other subject, they're still in second grade, going into third grade. And next year they're going to go to the intermediate school. They're going to take third grade math and third grade science and social studies and all of that. So you wouldn't have promotion in that scenario. That's going to be very, very rare, but it could happen. So what we decided is if you have any two of these, we will use the 60-40 split. And the element, when we look at the rankings over there on the left-hand side, the 40 to 35 to 25, whichever element is the higher rated would be the one that gets the 60%. So if you have proficiency and K3 literacy, it's the proficiency that gets the 60, and the improving K3 literacy would have 40. And then the same thing if you add promotion to fourth grade in literacy, the promotion has 60, improving K3 is 40. And if you just have proficiency in third grade reading and promotion to fourth grade, obviously that's the 60-40 split that you see on the screen. So like I said, we don't know since this is the first year whether we'll have any weird anomalies with these, but we could. So just because of the way the kids, you do your educational programming. So this is the grade scale. And again, that's why, this is a pretty aggressive scale. And you can see they looked at it using 2019 data and then again in 2021. And their hope is that, in short order and pretty quickly, we get back to this type of a distribution rather than having something that looks like this. But they want to take a look at this to make sure that this grade scale is appropriate. So please try to report as completely and correctly as possible with regard to all of the pieces, especially that retention promotion piece, and also make sure that you get your reading subscores. That has been used. I mean, the reading subscore always has been used for promotion to the fourth grade. And so it's not a new data element to report. We don't see widespread misreporting or forgetting to report. So it's just something, though, that you're going to want to pay extra attention since it's used twice. So again, you're going to have that same language that we've had for the others to help you talk to your community about your rating. And then the two pieces of diagnostic data that have to be put for report only, the current year diagnostic data. So of the kids in kindergarten, first, second, and third grade who took a diagnostic test in the fall of 21, the beginning of the 21-22 school year, what percent are on track versus what percent were not on track. We actually already display that on the report cards. It's just that now state law says we have to put it on. And then the other thing we have to do is we have to calculate a second promotion percentage and say the percent of students who are in the district or school who get promoted to fourth grade and are not subject to retention and completed all the grade levels offered prior to that grade in the same district or school. So one of the things I think the legislature heard is, I get all my kids out to fourth grade and promotable as long as they're with me. That those 4 years, I can get them up to a level where they're promotable. But if I get a bunch of third graders who move in, and they're 2 grade levels below, I can't get them up to a promotable level. And so my promotion percentage is less than 100%, but it's those kids that come in at the end. So we will actually be calculating something different to show a promotion percent for just those kids who've completed all 4 grades in the same district or school. So as we wrap up today's presentation, and before, do you have any questions on the early literacy component? I don't see anything in the chat. All right, so our next steps, as I said, the board approved the rules in March. They are final filed with JCAR. We are in the process of filing that amendment to our Every Student Succeeds plan. You can see the amendment. We did have it up for formal comment through June 1st. And we're obviously doing communications like crazy. And we are in the process of getting, because we're in year-end reporting right now. we are working on getting all of these new calculations in the secure data center, our new reports portal. You know, we had created a whole series of new reports, and what we always called the pretty reports, the ones that look a lot like your report card. And these are being revamped to take all of those new pieces that I discussed today and put them in. But these reports aren't going to be done for another few weeks. But you need to start looking at data now so that hopefully everything's reported and you don't have to appeal. Remember, the fewer appeals, the better, since especially that PI score is going to change if we have massive numbers of appeals, especially by high performing districts. So these are reports you can use today that have pieces of the calculations. So, and some of the data is not complete yet. You really have not started reporting the retention data. That comes later in the summer because kids, you know, again, in a normal year, you know, they have to go to summer school. They have to take the alternative test over the summer in some cases. And so we start collecting that a little bit later in the summer. But otherwise, and we obviously won't have value added because we don't even have all the test results yet. But, you know, you can start looking at things and you can start, you know, trying to gauge your test results, and you're improving the K3 readers piece, the K3 literacy improvement piece. You can start looking at that. So that's my contact information. The cell phone's still the best one. I'm in the office part-time, but the cell phone's best because I just have kept my office phone linked into my cell phone. So I think we're good on time. It looks like we've got about 5 or 6 minutes. Are there any last questions?
Yeah, feel free to unmute if you'd rather just ask it instead of type it. Thank you so much, Mary Ann. I have to say the feedback has been awesome. Everyone loved that we chunked it. I think it's
Great.
digesting this much better. So thank you. But yeah, type in the chat box or unmute, folks. We'll sit here for a few minutes and take questions. Remember to sign in. We want those emails off that sign in for those of you that want resources. Okay.
Yeah, this is a lot easier to do it because I can give a lot more of the details on some of the business rules as you're checking your data and using things that go into this. And I will tell you, we tried to change things as little as possible in terms of business rules from a standpoint of like where kids count, who counts for you. You know, the same kids that have always counted should be included in these pieces. So, you know, we're only going to hold you accountable for those kids, especially with test scores, you know, value added, growth, promotion, if you've had an adequate opportunity to serve the students.
Mary Ann, I had a quick question about the biology substitution scores for the AP. We have many kids that take AP Bio, AP Physics, and lots of those tests. So my question is it just the year that the student takes the biology test where the substitution can take place? How is that going to work? Are we going to, because I know we report their scores every year, but is there going to be retribution or going back? Because our kids take biology in 8th grade, and then they don't take these other assessments until later in high school.
Right. So if a student does that, if they take regular biology first, we'll just use that as their PI score for biology. And the way that we had done it in the past was the biology was considered to be a retake. I mean, because we use the higher of the two in a single school year, we treated it as a retake. And obviously, when we had the retake indicator, if a student scored proficient or higher, it was only in the indicators. And if they had scored proficient or higher, we didn't include them, which probably these kids did. So it probably would not be used at all because it's only first year tests. So if they took both tests in the same year, because they actually subbed AP for the regular biology, then we would look at the higher of the two. Otherwise, they'll be in for biology when they take the regular course and regular test, and we would not use their AP or IB test. So
Thanks for the clarification.
So Yeah, and that's for any test. Actually, the way that the PI score works is the first time they take the test, the first year, school year that we see that subject, we use it in a performance index. If they retake it sometime later, whether it's the exact same test or one that's a substitute, we don't include it the second time. So if they had to retake Algebra 1, because they didn't hit the competency score and they needed to do the retake for that per the law to get competency, we wouldn't put that second year Algebra 1. So, but if they took it twice in 1 year, we would take the higher of the two in the same school year. And again, that's regardless of whether it's the same Algebra 1 test at the state level taken in the fall and in the spring, or if for some reason they took the regular biology in the fall or spring, and then they took the AP test at some point. So we would use the higher range of the two tests. So from the same year.
Thanks, Mary Ann.
Sure. Other questions? And we've got 2 more sessions coming up. We're going to talk about graduation and prep for success, or the college career workforce and military readiness. And then we'll cover, and I think I'm going to put the overall grade if we have time in that one. And then we've got gap closing, which is a monster in and by itself that we'll cover. And we've got some student profile data. We've got a postgraduate data and then a whole student profile. So we've got 2 more sessions like this that are coming up of 90 minutes where we'll be able to delve into some more deeply into the business rules than I was able to do at the higher level. So hopefully some of you can come and especially, let your secondary people know for next session that we're going to speak about things that are germane to high schools.
Yep. And that session on Tuesday starts at